Spinoza started his career in a way interpreting Cartesian philosophy. He adopts a lot of Cartesian language and ideas and starting points. He's also, I would consider, very anti-Cartesian, and sometimes that part gets kind of covered over. I mean, a lot of people will say, Bergson, who's one of my favorite philosophers, says this, that and Whitehead and other people say this too, that that Spinoza uh, takes Cartesianism further than Descartes, or he takes it to its ultimate realization, you might say. I think there's some truth to that, but I think that it also misses the like radically anti-Cartesian elements. And we can talk about the kind of tensions of Bergsonian philosophy, because I know some people are at least a little familiar with that, with Spinoza. That's actually the topic of a article I'm working on right now. Okay, so let me move towards the theological political treatise. The ethics was a project he worked on for, I think, like 15 or 20 years before uh, passing away. And in a way, it was still in progress. And scholars have also suggested that there's another book that would have been written after this that would have been called like philosophy, for example, something like that. So the ethics would have been the starting point, and then something like philosophy could follow, which would have unpacked more of the metaphysics and other ideas beyond what we have. But this project, the basic structure of it, the insights, the claims, really was already present in his very early work called the Short Treatise, which comes before the theological political treatise, which is on God, man, and nature, I think. It's not in geometrical method, and it's very kind of brief and just sort of sets out some of the main claims that you'll find in the ethics without really any rigorous proof. But it's a very interesting text. But when he wrote the theological political treatise, he had already created in his mind basically the structure of the ethics. He hadn't finished it. He hadn't maybe cleaned up every single argument and that kind of thing, but he had a gestalt of the whole. He had the idea of, and he works within that system. And there are a lot of moments where he'll, start a chapter or something like that with a line that is almost verbatim from the ethics. And really, you can see the ethics as the sort of exhaustive proof of everything that he argues for in the theological political treatise. And I also think that the theological political treatise, first of all, it has this whole thread of biblical exegesis or biblical interpretation that we don't find at all in the ethics. There's almost no, I mean, he brings up like Adam once or twice and like a couple bigger themes, but for the most part, there's no textual tradition of either Christian or Jewish or Muslim ideas, which we do find in the theological political treatise, interestingly. I mean, one of the things with the ethics is that it just starts without a preface. It has no ceremonious beginning. It just immediately gives you definitions and axioms. Doesn't say like what we're doing, what the point of this is, where we're going, how we're supposed to even follow it, any of that stuff. I mean, you do get indications of that throughout, especially through the Scholia, as I mentioned, these kind of commentaries, but no introduction. In some sense, the theological political treatise, as well as another text, I'm pretty sure he published it. It was either published posthumously and just passed around between his friends, or was published anonymously, which is the treatise on the emendation of the intellect. Emendation meaning something between like a therapy, and he actually does connect it with an idea of like a therapeutic of the intellect, like healing the intellect, as well as strengthening, improving, developing. Those terms would be related to emendation. So the emendation of the intellect, real quick, Josh, I should say this and then you can jump in, is basically giving preface to what happens in the ethics, why he wrote the book, what he's searching for, the kind of uh, impetus behind the effort of the ethics. Like, what is the devotion and calling that he saw himself fulfilling in the ethics? We get that in the emendation of the intellect. Um, could have potentially read that, but I felt the Theological Political Treatise is enough. I do recommend people check it out if they're interested. It's pretty approachable. Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Um, I wanted to ask because I guess I didn't realize, and we only read Ethics 1 last semester, but that I guess like the TTP is, I think what I hear you saying, like very, I guess, scaffolded by the metaphysics Spinoza presents in the ethics. Has anyone done like a treatment on like the extent to which Spinoza seems to link his politics to his metaphysics? And the reason I ask is because that's, I would say, like pretty distinct from how Western political theory has advanced, especially in the since the late 20th century with Rawls and sort of like explicitly kind of divesting politics from metaphysics. So I'm just curious how Spinoza sees himself drawing a politics from his metaphysics and whether that's been commented on in the
Mm-hmm.
literature.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely has. What a book I was gonna talk about is Spinoza on learning to live together. It's like a political well, it's focused on politics. Susan James. Um, I will say, first of all, that he talks about politics only very tangentially, but he does within the ethics itself in part 4. So in part 4 of the ethics, there's explicit connections to political ideas, and there you can like make clear connections to the Theological Political Treatise. And we're going to read the what is it, like chapters 17 or whatever, the end through 20 for next week, which is all about the political side of the text. He also has his political treatise, which is unfinished, that he was writing after, well, that he was working on when the ethics was more or less completed. Uh, yeah, I mean, one of the sort of images or tropes that's been passed around about Spinoza is that he's I don't know if it's cross-eyed or what exactly it is, but he has his eyes in two directions at once. Either they're this way or like this, of the infinite and the eternal on the one hand, and the finite, the political, the actual, the concrete, and that he really never loses those two visions, as something admirable about his philosophy. But we'll talk about that a lot more, especially next week. Other questions at this point? So the TTP, the Theological Political Treatise, was massively scandalous, and it was outlawed, and it was condemned, and even Leibniz like said it was, I don't know, evil and terrible, things like this. And I say even Leibniz because Leibniz actually visits Spinoza in The Hague at some point, I think in like 75, around there. They had a long discussion and admiration. Spinoza or Leibniz clearly takes ideas from Spinoza, even though he's critical of Spinoza, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, I would say. He accuses him of being a um, what's the mystic Jewish Kabbalist? Yeah, he accuses him of being a Kabbalist, things like this. That's a complex relation. We can look into that more. It's also possible someone could do a midterm paper on Leibniz letter. Oh, sorry. Leibniz commentary on Spinoza's letter on the infinite. So Spinoza has this letter. I forget who exactly it's to, but on the infinite, and Leibniz has a commentary on it. So that's an option potentially for the midterm if people are interested in the Leibniz connection. Um, yeah, so the theological political treatise was, yeah, widely condemned, misread. Everybody basically said Spinoza's an atheist after reading it. And to be clear, and Carlyle points this out, what they meant is that like the idea of God becomes worthless. Not that Spinoza denies God's existence or doesn't believe in God, but that what he thinks God is just doesn't count as either religion or theology or theism and things like that. Then you have the polar opposite views that come out of Germany, like Schelling and Schleiermacher and Herder and Novalis. Novalis calls him the God drunk man, right? I mean, we can dig into all of this more. I mean, it might be more helpful to kind of just like go through what he actually says about religion and God and these ideas within the theological political treatise, where I see him genuinely thinking through religious ideas and ideas that will directly influence his philosophy in the ethics. He, first of all, was advancing textual interpretive scheme for how to do biblical interpretation and criticism, including at times very intense study of Hebrew grammar and like lexicological practices that I think are essential to continental philosophy. Continental philosophy just meaning like European philosophy that's obsessed with the history of philosophy and how to read the history of philosophy and things like that. The kind of exegetical tradition. I mean, obviously that existed in the medieval period as well, but as Spinoza objects to them, oftentimes they are so he Spinoza thinks that the prophets, the texts of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible are really extremely simple, and they teach basically one idea, which has two sides, which is the loving kindness that it's supposed to foster in the readers and the power of God as uh, revealed to humans through the imagination and as something that ought to um, instill obedience, and obedience being loving kindness, following love, practicing loving kindness. So he says anything beyond that, that the theologians have tried to read into it, is really just their attempt to take Aristotle and Plato and like classical Greek metaphysics and adapt it to some of those views. Aquinas is obviously in the crosshairs on this one, who directly does do that sort of thing. So there is something like deflationary and inflationary happening simultaneously. Like he's inflating the value of the moral teachings of the Old and New Testaments. Um, he is calling on certain figures as authorities, like, for example, Solomon, who he praises and who I think genuinely you see these ideas again within the ethics. So the reason I stress the genuinely is another big interpretive strategy with Spinoza, especially on the theological political treatise, but in terms of his, bearing on the question of God and all of this, is that really he's an atheist that is hiding his atheism. So he says, "Oh, I believe in God, but God is just nature." So he's doing a sleight of hand, and he's tricking us and that really he doesn't believe a lot of the things that he's saying. I, following Carlyle, disagree with this reading. I think that he does genuinely have a theological commitment, that he genuinely, well, the whole question of God or nature, or the equivalence of God and nature, Claire Carlyle does a really good job of kind of putting that into question without denying it. So clearly he does see substance, and this is jumping to the language of the ethics, substance as uniting nature and God, that there's no separation between God and nature when considered as substance. And we're going to have to spend so much more time unpacking that. Uh, but it is possible to find some differences, and we find even some differences in the theological political treatise, especially when we're going to move to this pretty soon, but the idea of natural law and divine law, which was one of the main topics that we saw today, and natural knowledge versus divine knowledge and divine law. So anyway, I just want to flag that it's possible that on an ontological level, God or nature are interchangeable words for the same substance, and yet that we shouldn't collapse that difference entirely, and that Spinoza is not collapsing that difference entirely. The same thing would go for like the parallelism between body and mind. Body and mind are two aspects or attributes of one underlying reality, and that underlying reality, on the one hand, is God, but also us as modes, right? As individual, singular existing things. So I involve both bodiliness and mentality. And those don't describe two entities, they describe one entity. And yet we keep them somewhat separate because they do have different features to them. And we shouldn't just, and I think this is another misreading of Spinoza I'm pushing against. We couldn't just say, all right, get rid of the mind side and go totally with the matter side, make Spinoza a materialist, or the opposite, make him entirely an idealist and forget about the nature side. I think both of those fail, and that we need to keep them somewhat distinct, even though ontologically they describe one reality. Well, this is also pertinent to the emendation of the intellect, where he talks about ideas of ideas. So again, I'm jumping way ahead of anything that we've covered this far, but every idea, every mind, everything on the side of mind and intelligence and that is the idea of a body. So there is my body, and then there's the idea of my body. These things are in parallel with each other. They don't causally interact. They're two ways of explaining the same reality. But the body is not a body of a body. And ideas we can have ideas of ideas. Now, a lot of having ideas about ideas becomes pretty empty. Like I have the idea of my body, and then I can form an idea of that idea. Like I can have an idea that that there is an idea of my body, right? In this play of ideas is not completely just superficial. It actually has a lot of import on questions of methodology and how the mind, when reflecting on itself, can improve itself. And there's a whole question of the emendation of the intellect, where the mind is acting on the mind, and where we form ideas of our ideas as essential, basically, to the methodology behind what he's constructing in philosophy. We'll talk about that when we get to ideas of ideas and the body and the parallelism. This is all in part 2 and 3 of the ethics. So we're still a ways off from that. I will say this, though, to start. The body for Spinoza is kind of elevated, and without making it into a quasi-conscious thing. So the body, so first of all, Spinoza proclaims a kind of, we got to get our passions in control. But he says it's not the mind that controls the body when we get our passions under control. The body manages itself when we do that, and the mind manages itself when we do that. Those are two ways of talking about the same thing. So if I am capable of like overcoming, anger and hatred and envy and these kinds of antisocial emotions that the ethics instructs us to in fact overcome, we shouldn't say that it's because like Descartes says and others and like maybe even Plato and stuff say that the mind is somehow controlling the body or that the mind is subduing the passions of the body. No, the body in its intelligent structuring is doing that to itself. And we can look at that from two different angles. In terms of the natural law versus divine law, there's going to be a tension there because it is natural law, according to Spinoza, that we do anything that we're capable of doing. So that has no dictate, like that has no relation to, first of all, what society and the state and religion say that we should do. There's all sorts of things that we're capable of doing that fall outside of those legislations, right? So those are our natural rights. Anything that is capable of occurring is within our natural rights. And those natural rights are the natural law. On the other hand, the divine law points to, in a way, our path towards uh, emancipation, towards knowledge, towards and the increase of our power. Basically, divine law is that we should know God, and he plays on this word from the Hebrew, Judah, Jada. He mentions this in chapter 4, section 12 of the Theological Political Treatise. Jada means both knowledge and love. And this is key. I mean, this is like the main idea of the end of the ethics. This is where everything's headed, what he calls the intellectual love of God, where Jada means intimate knowledge or a knowledge through a loving relationship. I mean, there's so many particularities here. I mean, we'd have to talk a lot more about his necessitarianism. This is like a main uh, pillar of Spinoza's thought, and the question of freedom, and what I would call a compatibilism in Spinoza, which is that he wants to say everything is necessary, but that there are two kinds of necessity. There is free necessity, which, yeah, that probably sounds like an oxymoron. And one of the goals of this class is to kind of think through that. Like, is that an oxymoron or is that like a completely intelligible notion? Obviously, for any of the Bergsonian familiar people, the question of freedom is the main tension between Spinoza and Bergson. Bergson is obsessed with freedom, and Spinoza appears to deny free will completely. And he does deny free will as having a particular definition, but he doesn't deny everything that would likely fall under our understanding of free and freedom. So he does have an idea of free, being free, and of freedom. He defines freedom in part one of the ethics, in the definitions. So it's one of the first things he introduces, which again, there's no preface, but it does indicate that that question is going to be essential. He has a kind of Stoic view of freedom. So the Stoics said, like, if you take a cylinder or a ball or something and roll it down a plane, like down a hill, the freedom is the expression of that cylinder's drive, essentially downhill. Spinoza doesn't cite this, but there's something very similar to this. The word obedience here is so key because I mentioned this already, and this word comes from Hobbes, but acquiescentia in Latin, which we have the word acquiesce, or yeah, basically acquiesce. So if you acquiesce, there are sort of two ways of acquiescing. One is obedience through command. So I don't know anything. I'm just submitting to something that either scripture or an authority or my parents or somebody like that tell me to do, right? I'm obedient insofar as I acquiesce. I give over my assent, my affirmation to an idea that I don't understand. On the other hand, we can do that through knowledge, right? I might want something, but I have knowledge that I shouldn't do that because it's going to be bad for me or something, right? I don't know. We could think of 100 probably examples. So in that sense, I acquiesce, but I follow, obey what I know through knowledge, what I know through understanding, right? What I know through wisdom. And so free necessity, according to Spinoza, is based in knowledge, based in understanding, based in the expression of our well intended understanding of things acting in the world. So there is something like freedom there. Divine law is not a strictly moral question. It can refer to all the potential there is to do anything. Again, it's very like natural law, and there's not actually a clear distinction, or there's not a real distinction between these things. He erodes the distinction between these things throughout the chapters that we read, and he lands on this idea of divine natural law. Um, this is really put into a precise formula in Proverbs, which is written by King Solomon, who, again, Spinoza, I think, has a lot in common with. I mean, he says that Solomon is not really fully a prophet. He really just has wisdom and natural knowledge, and exalts us to pursue natural knowledge and wisdom. In Proverbs 16:22, he says that understanding, also translated prudence and discretion, understanding is a wellspring of life to those who possess it. And the punishment for ignorance is the ignorance itself. I mean, this is how Spinoza kind of rewords it. The original is like folly is the punishment of ignorance. So basically, the idea is this: there's nothing outside of virtue. There's nothing outside of power. There's nothing outside of fulfilling the divine law. Those are all equal for Spinoza. I'll talk more about that, the kind of equation between those. But there's nothing outside of that we seek it for. We don't seek virtue for a prize. You know, this is common to kind of certain Christian, I would say, mutilations that, you know, do good things and you'll be given a reward after you die, right? And a lot of the stuff you're going to do is going to suck. You're going to have to like say no to a whole bunch of things that would have been really awesome, but you'll get a reward for it later. Spinoza thinks that this is completely wrong, that the reward of virtue is virtue itself, and that virtue and power and our fulfillment of the divine law, and again, our fulfillment of the divine law is basically to know and love God through jhada, right? An intimate knowledge, which he says we should just do this through the way that we understand natural things, which again doesn't mean just study nature. And a lot of people thought maybe it meant that, but what it does mean is to use the same resources that we use to understand nature, like geometric method of exposition, to understand God, the mind, our heart, the moral side of things. And yeah, so the second half of this Solomon proverb, 16:22, is that ignorance is its own punishment. And this is a major idea of the Theological Political Treatise that we read, and the Ethics is basically that, we don't have to wait until we die to be punished for our wickedness and for our sin and for these things. Wickedness and sin for Spinoza is basically just our ignorance of things. I mean, he's going to root this primarily in 2 or 3 affects being emotional states. And these are flagged again and again throughout the Theological Political Treatise. The preface, which we didn't read, starts out on a tirade against superstition. Spinoza is not new to this discourse against superstition. All of the figures who had been sort of outlawed and things like that before him were also attacking it. And then in chapter 3, we saw a lot on envy. I would say envy is the mother of all prejudices for Spinoza. I'm borrowing that line from another scholar. It is really I don't want to say it's the root of all evil, but it is the manifestation of a malignant evil within human life that superstition fosters, first of all. So, okay, let me say what envy is, first of all. Envy is two things. First of all, it is a pain that I feel, and pain for Spinoza means a weakening of my power. They go hand in hand. We'll get into that much later, but a pain that I feel at someone else's joy and flourishing, someone else that I hate, right? I hate somebody, something good happens to them, and I feel sad, I feel angry, I get all these things. That's one side of envy. The other side is the pleasure that one derives from seeing someone that they hate suffer and suffer misfortune or be harmed or something like that. Now, we'll have a lot of time to unpack all of the particularities about envy and how it can really be kind of the mother of all sad passions, let's say, the mother of all of our, you could say, antisocial and dysfunctional passions, emotions. But, Spinoza says, look at Christianity. It is a religion of love that teaches basically a very simple message. And when he says simple, that can sound belittling, but it's not actually belittling, especially from like a Neoplatonic perspective. And people in the Christian tradition and Jewish tradition have a high status for things that are simple. There's something beautiful about simplicity, and there's something beautifully simple about loving kindness and justice. They're kind of orientation and direction. They don't have a complex. I mean, they do within human society and within convention and these things, but they are more or less an orientation of the heart. In I want to say it's chapter 1 on it is chapter 1 on prophecy. He talks about heart. I don't know the Hebrew word, but he tells us it. And ruah, I'm probably butchering the hell out of that, but is spirit, breath, life. And Spinoza does a textual analysis across the Old Testament books to show the multiplicity of senses that this word spirit takes. And I think it's fascinating on multiple levels. First of all, it points to ideas in the ethics that don't get such, there's no talk of spirit in the ethics. And I'm from this Bergsonian tradition in France that spiritualism is a big thing. And so finding this, I'm like, holy shit, there is like a whole spiritualist side of Spinoza here. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and it's how it works into his idea of divine law. And then there's also an interesting question just about textual reading. So there's this classic analytic distinction between lumpers and splitters. Have people heard this idea? So a splitter is an analyzer, right? And a lumper is somebody like Plotinus, who muddles definitions by connecting 1,000 things that seem different. And that's exactly what happens with this term, ruah. And I do think that there's something, and I think Spinoza points this out, that there's something true to the phenomena that makes this word so multiplicitous, that makes it show up in a million different situations, that they are really pointing at something ontologically unifying these multiplicity of. So Plotinus, for example, talks about you take a person's face and you put mirrors all around their face. Like the intellect needs to do this in some way. Like each aspect of the face can be viewed from a perspective. You can't just take one picture of the face and say, this is the definition of Rua, whatever. Yeah. You need this kind of lumping together of things that are perhaps incongruent and maybe even inconsistent with each other. So spirit is like that. So he says that it indicates in different passages, and I highly recommend people look at this because all the passages are there. It's really interesting. Spirit, breath, life, strength, courage, ability, capacity, sentiment, and even passion. In different contexts, this word takes on these different meanings. And for Spinoza, like these are actually all the same phenomena talked about in different contexts. And then he says that what we find in the prophets is that they're particular, let's say, exceptional individuals whose imagination is for some reason, impressed or imbued or filled by some revelation of God. And rather than it having anything to do with natural knowledge of the world or having any bearing on our intelligence, it is entirely related to the imagination, and the imagination not just of the prophet in particular, although he says, there are these happy prophets that prophesy about great things, and then there are these melancholic prophets who prophesy about terrible things. So in that case, it's that particular individual prophet's body, their disposition, their affects, their emotions, that determines their perspective on God. And they communicate something real, but only about one very specific area, which is, again, the moral, ethical orientation that this revelation instills. And again, there's only one very simple teaching there: loving kindness and the justice of God through the divine law. And he also pushes this idea that in the in the Old Testament, spirit, ruah, is the moral orientation of the heart. And he kind of poses this as the connecting thread of all these things. So anytime a person in the ancient tradition, in these traditions, experienced something of God, some attribute of God, and again, Spinoza says, we don't need revealed religion to have an experience of God. We all have an experience of God by the sheer fact that we perceive physical things around us. Because to Spinoza, that is not a degradation of God's essence or reality or virtue or anything, it is an expression of it. And we all have the possibility of forming natural knowledge of the world, even though most of us don't do anything about that, especially in his time. It's not the case for this class, I'm sure. And that constitutes knowledge of God. Now, it is not prophetic knowledge, but there are extreme limits to prophetic knowledge as well. And the prophets, and he even includes Jesus here, although he doesn't say that Jesus is a prophet. He says that Jesus had the mind of God. But Jesus and the prophets, they all had to use their imagination in order to make the insights about loving kindness and God's justice tangible to other people, and above all, something that they can follow, something that they can obey, something they can acquiesce to. So anytime anyone ever experienced anything of the divine nature, especially for the Israelites, they called it the Spirit of God. And so they would say, this person who's strong had godlike strength. That just doesn't mean that this person was God or that they're God's strength or something like that. But because God's nature is strength and virtue and justice and law and power, anything that imitates that can be called that. But what Spinoza says is that this is really just the way in which the human mind and body are participating in the divine power. And he says basically that there's nothing in the Old Testament and almost nothing in the New Testament that speaks about God's nature in itself. Only the effects of our knowledge of God and the revelation of God within our bodies and within our imaginations and within our historical contexts. Prophecy is necessarily a privileged knowledge that one person dispenses, right, through like obscure signs and ideas and imagery that has to be followed by faith. It isn't something that explains itself. When you learn about a triangle, you find within that idea why that idea is compelling. It doesn't have anything to do with me or my prestige or my ability to converse with God. We all have that natural knowledge. And again, that's divine knowledge, accessible. And the truth of it, he says that each person can discern and embrace this truth with all of the certainty and entitlement of the one who tells it to them. That is not the case for prophecy. The prophet is way more convinced in what, because they've experienced it directly. And ultimately for Spinoza, the insights that the prophets give us aren't barred either from natural knowledge. We can find those out through our, well, as he's going to do in the ethics, that loving kindness is the main object of human life. Like these kinds of things. These are demonstrable through reason. That ultimately the core takeaway of the prophets is divine justice and loving kindness. And we can come to that through natural knowledge. It doesn't mean that like through natural knowledge we can just like induce prophetic. I mean, that's an interesting question. People have kind of like pushed here where there are aspects of Spinoza that are kind of like prophetic in what they're attempting to do through inculcating basically his philosophy, right? So the hard division there can be eroded slightly, I think. But Spinoza will never claim what I think prophecy has to claim, which is that an event occurred and I had a download or an insight or whatever, and I can't just like guarantee that you're going to have that, right? But I can describe it to you, and I can put it into, I can use my imagination to make it amenable to you. In the ethics, he's going to say there are three kinds of knowledge, sort of four. Knowledge by the imagination, knowledge through reason, and intuition. Some people would say, oh, we leave behind the imagination and reject it. I think that this is like a completely false reading. I think that there is a, well, I don't want to get too Hegelian, but a kind of Aufheben of the imagination within, which means like an inclusion and a surpassing. So reason surpasses the imagination, but it still allows the imagination its place. And I would also say when Spinoza says there are three types of knowledge and puts imagination in there, we shouldn't think that imagination is just falsehood, although imagination opens us to falsehood. That's going to take more unpacking, and like Spinoza himself isn't doing all the work in anticipating these later readings of imagination, but you're on the right path with that. I never know how to pronounce this word. Insurpassable, unsurpassable. I don't know what the word is, but you cannot get rid of it. You cannot get past it. I would also say it's an activity of the body. It's not just a faculty of the mind or of the soul or something like that. Although there is that component there, it's an activity of the body, and it's an activity of the body in complex relationality with the ecologically, you might say, with the entire physical world. Yeah, I mean, we could say more, and I think it is clear that for Spinoza, the prophets are not to be thrown out, and they're not bullshitters. And there are people who, for whom imagination and obedience lead to a happy life, and there will always be people who just like leave it at that level. So while Spinoza says we should be pushing for this emancipation from commandment towards free knowledge, that's like the primary goal of theological political treatise. We'll see that by the end, that like free thought and like doing science and philosophy is the main goal. Not everybody's going to do that. And there's no problem with certain people just having religion, and it's enriching for them, and it makes their life morally oriented and politically like palatable. Now, of course, that is if we remove from religion all of these horrible anti-social dimensions of superstition and envy. I mean, I started mentioning this earlier, that he says, the Christians are all about loving kindness, but look at them. They all hate each other, and all they do is talk about how much they hate each other. Like, that's not part of the religion. So we have to remove a lot of things from religion as it stands, according to Spinoza. But we do know in a letter, I think it's in a letter, that he was talking to his landlady about someone, and he says like, oh, this person is a Christian. That's great. It seems to be serving them well. They're obedient to the divine command of loving kindness, and therefore they're a pious person, right? So, I mean, one of the big claims with Carlyle, and even just in the political treatise itself, theological political treatise, is the definition of religion, right? I mean, religion is, well, and the one, he says it in two different places. He says in the ethics and in theological political treatise, slightly different, but they overlap and mean the same thing. Yeah, in the ethics, he says, whatever we desire and do insofar as we know God. And again, know, we should think jhada, which is an intimate knowledge, and love, because he talks about the intellectual love of God in the ethics as well. In the theological political treatise, religion is only a virtue. It's maybe even a smaller definition, and it's one that's meant to encapsulate these two possibilities. On the one hand, we only use our imagination and we obey, right? And on the other hand, we fulfill our highest possible power through pursuing knowledge of God, and each of these is considered religion. But basically, religion is the virtue of loving kindness. And you could see how loving kindness, and again, in Christian context, this is called charity or agape, how Spinoza can kind of like meld this in a way with natural knowledge, especially through Solomon, so that religion is the virtue, the power, the knowledge, the jhada of precisely building, enhancing natural knowledge, other people's minds, philosophy, philosophical conversation. And again, this isn't like Spinoza is a very he's not kind of saying there's this doctrine of knowledge, maybe it's Descartes, whatever, encyclopedic kind of understanding of things, and that like we should just bow and assent to it or something, but rather the emendation of the intellect as a project, as a perhaps always incomplete project, and as a project that necessarily depends on a scholarly community of interdependent thinkers working together, right? That really religion ends up encapsulating good scholarship and being in a scholarly community. And it necessitates to us, and I think that we can probably attest to this in our own lives, that on the one hand, once you've tasted philosophy, you won't live without it. You're not going to say, no, I'll just like do without this. Right? And like the same thing goes for being in a community of people who care for each other and genuinely work towards each other's flourishing, right? And in that way, we acquiesce with our mind. He thinks it's part of our essence, which we'll get into all of that, but our essence is kanatos, which is striving, but a striving that strives for not only my own intensification and perfection and virtue and expansion and development, but that of others who will in turn help me in that. This he flags this in the Theological Political Treatise. I think it's at the beginning of chapter 3. It's either 3 or 4. Let me just. Oh, it's in 3 on the vocation of the Hebrews. True joy and happiness lie in the simple enjoyment of what is good and not in the kind of false pride that enjoys happiness because others are excluded from it. Right? That's the envy piece. No one is wiser because they see themselves as above another person. You don't gain power by putting someone else down. This is like one of the main, I think, lessons. You gain power through having other people that you can be collaborative with, right? Anyway, we'll get to all of those larger sort of, I would call them like imperatives, although I think a lot of people would be allergic to that terminology in a Spinozist. I mean, Spinoza is certainly anti, I don't know even how I'm supposed to finish sentence, but anti-Kantian, which doesn't make sense because he's before Kant, but I think it's true. I mean, he's not in favor of a deontological duty ethics, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about this. There's a French spiritualist named Jean-Marie Goyot. This is his book on Epicurus, but there's a chapter in here on Spinoza. He also wrote a book that was influential on Bergson. I'm getting again off track with Bergson, but called the Sketch of Morality, Independent of Obligation and Sanction. And it's very Spinozist. And there's a critique of obligation. And we already see that here with this idea of obedience, right? And he points to the fact that, Solomon isn't considered particularly pious. He's considered to be wise. And his wisdom is what allows him to oftentimes like break the laws of the Jewish state at the time. So there are two types of necessity. First is free necessity, and the second is compelled. And this tracks a distinction between transitive causality and intransitive. Actually, I have those backwards. Intransitive is related to free necessity, and transitive is related to compelled. Now, within the compelled necessity, this is where things are bumping into each other in the world, right? Forces are coming into conflict or agreement. And that's precisely, there are two types of compelled necessity. Those that are in conflict with each other and those that are in agreement. I can have medicine that is enhancing the movements of my body and prolonging them and preserving them. And it could even be the same medicine under a different dosage becomes poisonous, right? So within compelled, there are kind of good and bad ones, if we want to use simplistic language there. But in free necessity, they're always good, and they're always virtues, and they're always knowledge, and these sort of things. The idea of my body, I'm just going to go through this very brief, but like the idea of my body is what like keeps my body in homeostasis and preserves it. There's nothing about the idea of my body. There's nothing about the, you could say, order and connection and makeup of the parts of my body that is destroying itself. It is only affirming and prolonging and advancing itself. This is Spinoza's idea. Okay. Obedience is on the side of compelled and natural knowledge and freedom and these kinds of things. I would even think that maybe the prophets have some kind of mixture, but there is some free necessity in them, and there is some free necessity in us following obediently the laws, the divine law. Insofar as we cultivate loving kindness and appreciate divine justice and these kinds of things, then there's some shred of free necessity in those. So it's not an either or. It's not like on this side you're totally, unless you're just like one of these, like, I don't know, inquisitors who's completely superstitious and just like paranoid about everything and feeling envy all the time and like ordering all types of atrocities and just like a warmonger. He points at Alexander, who we know is like not a great guy, like war crimes, like upon war crimes and this kind of thing. They are completely compelled. They do not have any free necessity. Now, they're explainable through the natural laws. So there's nothing like outside of the natural law going on when you have these kind of dispositions. But basically, they are prisoners or slaves to their fear. And their fear gives them what he calls fluctuations of the mind. And he talks about this in terms of superstition, where, we can see this in QAnon even maybe today, where there's this need for like a new conspiracy, some new credulity, some new like outlandish superstitious thing, because as he says, like it hasn't let them down yet, right? every incredulity kind of eventually is going to let you down. So there's this need for like new ones. So there's this like frenzy, right? And instability in the mind. And that frenzy and instability, first of all, we can understand it, I would say, like organically. And now I'm like imparting Bergsonian, Whiteheadian, even German idealist notions, but there's like something natural and organic about this state. So it's completely within the realm of nature. It's not against the laws of nature. There's nothing wrong in those senses. It doesn't violate anything with being completely miserable, violent person. And this is another reason why people are like, oh, Spinoza is an immoralist. No, I mean, he doesn't want this at all. He's drawing a plan of how to get out of this. He's rebuking and critiquing this as a plague to society and religion and these things. But it's not on the level of natural law. um, and this is again the proverb by Solomon, that the punishment of wickedness is the wickedness itself. The punishment of ignorance is the life that comes from being ignorant, right? Which is bondage to the passions again, right? And an inconstant mind and a heart that is constantly at variance with itself. If there's something fundamentally at war in the mind of the person who feels envy, because you hate someone that you should love. They're another human. To Spinoza, a human is to another human as a god. This is a line he uses. Or another phrasing of this is, two people working together is the same as three working alone, which is the idea of a person is to another person as a god. It breaks with the, you could say, laws of thermodynamics, right? 2 + 2 = 3 when humans are engaged in fellowship and not hatred. Another idea is basically like hatred and violence and envy and these antisocial affects wound the one who wields them, right? It stunts us. It lowers our power. It keeps us trapped at an infantile state, you could say. And this is pervasive through culture. And of course, there are those rare individuals who actually exhibit loving kindness. And this is outside of religious denominations, right? He says everyone beyond the Christians and the Jews have virtue. Not all of them, a couple. It's rare, but it's there. And it's everywhere. It's in all societies. There are always people who exhibit this virtue, right? So this is his definition of religion. It is non-denominational. And for the most part, the denominational divisions of religions have erased it and made it secondary when it's really the only teaching of any of them. What else did I want to say on this? Yeah, I guess just more about the affects. So there's going to be a whole chapter or a whole book of the ethics about the affects. And this is one of the, I would say, for the 21st century, one of the most important of the texts, especially because of Deleuze's reading of it. Superstition is born of fear. All the emotions have a kind of expanding and contracting relationship with each other. They're kind of like the Russian doll, nested gestalt kind of idea. Um, he will actually say, I'm going to approach the emotions as a geometer approaches questions of lines, points, and figures. Now, this sounds extremely mechanistic in its determinism, but I argue that it is not. And actually, if we look at natural knowledge through geometry, in the same way that I mentioned already before, that another human is to a human as a god, or what that essentially means is that 1 + 1 = 3, uh, lines and points do not equal a triangle. There is a new sui generis power and idea and unity that emerges in the idea of a triangle that is irreducible to the lines and points, right? So the parts, a triangle is nothing but lines and points. But it is more than them as well, right? The figure is made of lines and points, but the idea of a triangle is, first of all, not contained in lines and points themselves, right? It's something additional to them. And furthermore, we can use triangles in new contexts that go beyond the delimitations of the idea of the triangle. So it's actually not mechanistic and static in that way. It's actually expansive and in a way contradicts the mechanistic, you could say, first law of thermodynamics, that energy is never created or destroyed. Precisely what happens with virtue and what happens when we follow the divine law, i.e., pursue natural knowledge of nature and God, we draw more out of ourselves than we contain and out of each other. We break the first and second laws of thermodynamics in a way. We introduce more power and virtue into existence than what's contained in the conditions thereof. Okay, so I was already saying that there's an organic form of envy, and that in a way we get in a feedback loop. This is again a kind of like ecological reading. I think it's completely there, the organic approach. And so in a way, like one way I like to describe it is emotions have momentum to them. This idea of momentum is going to be really important. The idea of kinatos is connected here. But ideas have momentum. If I start hating people, that hate is going to like build up and it's going to become unstoppable and it's going to suck the rest of my life into it. And he thinks that the same thing happens with our virtue and our power and our good emotions. So both of them involve feedback loops, both positive and negative feedback. People are familiar with the terms positive and negative. Basically, negative feedback loop is not always negative in the sense of bad. It is just one that is regulative, let's say. So instead of something running off and increasing or decreasing or whatever, it stays within a certain area. It's kind of held in a metastable state. That's basically what happens with envy. I mean, it's in a way, it's pulling us down constantly. Our nature, the very essence of our being, is to expand in knowledge and to be curious and to understand things. And envy is constantly pulling that back, erasing the possibility of escaping from bondage in that emotion. So it has this negative feedback. It can also have a positive feedback in the sense of frenzy that I mentioned earlier, right? Superstition, for example, is self-amplifying and runs wild and it spreads and has that kind of effect. So anyway, those are going to be ways in which we can understand the emotions. Um, Superstition is born of fear. He says it's born, maintained, and nourished by fear. There you already get kind of a dynamic and organic sense of superstition. It works to preserve itself in strange ways. And I think we can all see this, and we can even see this today with like QAnon and things like that. It's a kind of addiction, right? And he even says that it is, in a way, like the cause of war, or at least like the ferociousness of war and violence. And one of the ways that it works to preserve itself, again, is to preclude doubt and reflection. And this becomes like explicitly the doctrine behind superstitious religions in the West. Um, that is to say, you know, even to the point of like God hates wise people because they're proud, right? That's a real thread of Judeo-Christian religions that Spinoza criticizes. He points to Solomon and a number of and Paul and other people in order to say this is insane and extremely dangerous. He speaks about fear of God as like a wise form of fear of God in the context of Solomon. So there you're like, okay, maybe he has like a positive sense of fear. But I would think for the most part, he would see it as a sad passion that indicates a limitation, not indicates, but traces a limitation or a decrease in our power. And in that sense, fear would like never be good. Like he says for sure, hate is never good. This is one of the propositions of part 4. When we want to talk about like, so here's an example. Like he doesn't like humility, but he likes a sort of um, you might say like refined confidence that isn't ambition, where like I know what's in my power. I recognize when other people have more power than me, and I'm not just like belligerent about my confidence, right? So he doesn't like humility where we're unnecessarily uh, depraving ourselves of either value or judgment or an understanding of our power. But he also doesn't like the opposite, right? Ambition going too far. So there's a type of fear that he'll like, but I mean, he thinks that fear and hope are basically bad. But again, there's a type of hope that that isn't bad. So fear, insofar as it is a source of fluctuation within the mind, is just a sad passion. But there's something like a shadow form of fear that we already see kind of here in this idea of the fear of the wise fear of God. So you know how there's like an objection to modern Christianity, which is like, there are people who don't get saved because they never knew about God. Like, what the hell's up with that? That seems unjust and like it goes against. So Spinoza has like a take on this whole question. And I think you could say like the reason that question is like valid for Christians is because the same critique he poses against Judaism in chapter 3, that there's a chosen people, they're the only ones who can get. So basically, is there religion outside of Christianity, or is everything outside of Christianity heretical, right? And the Christians will say it's heretical. Then, if you take that position, then this criticism stands, right? At least partially. Spinoza rejects the idea that anyone could possibly be ignorant of God and God's power and the divine law and this like utterly simple orientation of the heart towards loving kindness. He thinks that like everybody has some knowledge of this, that it's impossible for people to not have some understanding of it. Understanding brings peace and calm and beatitude and joy and these affects, while ignorance festers, makes us fester in our unhappiness, our sad passions, our fluctuations of our mind, our proclivity towards violence and violent emotions, and envy and these kinds of things. I mean, this is a sort of Cartesian claim and really similar to like spiritualist claims that will lead up to Bergson, who I can't for some reason stop mentioning, but that the mind reveals divine, well, that the mind is the primary source of divine revelation, and that everyone has a shred of that divine revelation inborn in them because of their mind, because they are a mind, and because the mind is a participation in divine nature. The idea of participation, I follow Carlyle as like an essential idea in Spinoza. I mentioned before our short break that I have like an image that I wanted to share with you that came to me about this. And I'm partially basing this on an idea in Berkeley, and I don't want to go too far in that direction because there's major differences between Spinoza and Berkeley. But Berkeley has this idea that there's a film or a screen between us and God, and that this screen for Berkeley is matter, but forget about that for a second. Instead, it is the system of concepts and affects that we have created since our childhood in order to practically get around in the world, to respond to things, to know how to interact with things. In a way, it is the world ordered by our egoism, or at least our egoism adopts this system of signs and symbols and imaginations and affects for its own needs and kind of keeps us in that. So in a way, we don't see God. So one of the big things people will pose to Spinoza, and I think is like a somewhat reasonable thing to pose. If we are God, if we are in God, if we are of God, if all of our reality and power is an expression of God, why is it that we are ignorant of God, acting badly, don't understand things, putting ourselves in misery, stuck in bondage, all of these kind of questions? So this is the answer for Spinoza in a way. And it's also slightly Neoplatonic. And I can give a reference to an article on the relation between Spinoza and Neoplatonism. I'm sure it's going to come up again in the class. There are major differences and things, but I mean, participation is a Neoplatonic concept, or it's a concept that comes from Plato that the Neoplatonics also use. And there are major differences, but between the Neoplatonic idea of participation and Spinoza's. Well, first of all, let me just make clear about that. Imitation. Like, we are not participating in divine nature, according to Spinoza, through imitation. This would be like a kind of Aquinas view as well. We got to keep separate, utterly separate, the creator and the created. So if we participate in divine nature, it's only through imitation. There's still like a gap that will never be overcome. So I think that what I'm about to describe with this film is another alternative that is Spinoza's alternative. So when we see another person act with loving kindness, the screen goes away or they become transparent and we see through them directly to God. And in general, for Spinoza, actually, the goal is not to delete matter. It is to delete the mutilated ideas that arise from our practical need and our ego, and that are sort of, appropriated by the ego, and to see through singular things the nature of God. So it's not to get rid of the singular things, not to get rid of the concrete world. It's not to get rid of matter or any of that, but it is to see, it is that when another person acts with loving kindness, or when we do so, or when we have the divine nature revealed to us through our mind, In all of these cases, it's really just a transparency within that film. It is that we can see through it and see what was always behind it. There are two types of obedience, right? There's the imagination obedience where we follow commands. And then on the other hand, there's the free necessity of obedience where, again, like once you've tasted philosophy, you can't live without it and you want it. And you can't say, I'll just live a life without this, right? So you go to school and you pay money and you talk to people and you spend hours, I don't want to say wasting your time, but you could be making money or doing something else. And instead you're putting all that time into there, right? That is obeying the free necessity of the nature of the mind itself, which inherently knows the power and value of philosophy, knows the power and value of the community of scholars working together without envy, right? Genuinely wanting each other to succeed and genuinely even wanting each other to succeed beyond ourselves so that we can be pulled up, so that we can pull each other up, right?